Ellen DeGeneres stopped mid-sentence, watching the 17-year-old sitting across from her speak about education reform with the precision of a policy expert and the passion of someone fighting for her own future. Zara Washington's hands moved as she spoke, gesturing with the confidence of someone who had addressed school boards and city councils, but her eyes held something that made Ellen's heart race, the fierce determination of a young woman who refused to accept that zip code should determine destiny. What happened in the next 60 seconds would become more than television. It would become the moment when youth activism met seasoned advocacy, and America got a preview of its future leadership. Nobody in that Warner Bros. Studio knew they were about to witness something that would influence education policy nationwide. Not the cameras rolling, not the producers frantically taking notes about this articulate teenager's policy proposals, and certainly not Zara Washington, who thought she was just there to talk about her school's resource campaign, before returning to a system that seemed designed to limit her potential. But Ellen knew. Ellen had been planning this moment for 6 weeks, ever since a viral video had made her call someone whose life's work had been dedicated to ensuring every child gets the education they deserve. The video was shot on a phone at a school board meeting. In it, Zara Washington, poised despite her age, with natural authority and eyes that demanded attention, was addressing a room full of adults about something they had failed to fix for decades: educational inequality. But what made the video go viral wasn't just her impressive command of statistics about funding disparities and achievement gaps. It was what she said at the end, looking directly at the board members. "You've had 40 years to fix this. My generation doesn't have 40 more to wait. We're graduating in a few months, and we're taking this fight with us. The question is, will you be part of the solution, or will we have to solve it without you?" But this is where the story gets extraordinary, because Michelle Obama had seen that video. Ellen had seen that video, and what they decided to do about it would amplify not just Zara's voice, but the voices of young activists everywhere, who understood that education wasn't just about their own futures, it was about justice itself. Now, as Zara sat in that familiar blue chair wearing a blazer she'd bought for debate tournaments, the same blazer she'd worn to every school board meeting for the past year, she had no idea that her political hero was backstage, equally impressed by this teenager's combination of passion and pragmatism. Ellen leaned forward, her characteristic energy focused by genuine admiration for this young woman's courage. "Zara, you're 17 years old, but you speak about education policy like someone who's been fighting these battles for decades. How did you become so informed about systemic issues?" Zara straightened slightly, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had learned that facts were her most powerful weapon. "When you see your friends struggling with 20-year-old textbooks while schools across town have smartboards in every classroom, Ellen, you start asking questions. When your AP classes get canceled because there's no funding but the football team gets new uniforms, you start researching budget allocations." The studio audience was already captivated, sensing this wasn't typical teenage activism. There was something deeper here. Someone who had done the homework on systems most adults didn't understand. "Tell me about your school. What made you decide to take on the school board?" Zara's face showed a flicker of the frustration that had driven her to action. "Martin Luther King Jr. High School. And yes, the irony isn't lost on any of us. We're named after one of the greatest advocates for equality in American history, but our school has been systematically underfunded for 20 years. 68% of our students qualify for free lunch, but our per-pupil spending is 40% less than schools in wealthier districts just 15 minutes away." Ellen was studying Zara's face, seeing something she rarely encountered, someone who had channeled righteous anger into strategic action. What's the most frustrating part about fighting for change at 17? For the first time, Zara's composed exterior cracked slightly. Adults patting you on the head and saying "good for you" while doing nothing. Being told you're inspiring but not being given a seat at the table where decisions are made. Having school board members say they appreciate my passion but then explain why change isn't possible. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "Ellen, I've read every education policy report from the last decade. I've analyzed budget documents that school board members admitted they hadn't read. I've organized student surveys, created presentations with solutions, not just complaints, but because I'm 17, I'm told to wait my turn." Ellen felt something stir in her chest. Here was a young woman who had done the work, learned the system, and been dismissed because of her age. "Zara, what's your vision for education? If you could change anything, what would it be?" Zara's eyes lit up with the kind of passion that comes from seeing solutions where others see problems. Universal access to rigorous curriculum, regardless of zip code. Equal funding formulas that account for student needs, not just property values. teacher retention programs that respect educators as professionals, and student voice in educational governance, because we're the ones living with these decisions. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. This is my comprehensive education reform proposal. 47 pages of research-backed recommendations that I've presented to everyone who will listen. Some board members called it impressive for a high school student. I call it a blueprint for justice. But Ellen wasn't just listening as a talk show host anymore. She was listening as someone who was about to facilitate a conversation between this remarkable young activist and someone who had spent 8 years in the White House fighting for educational equity, someone who understood that the future of democracy depended on ensuring every child had access to excellence. Zara, Ellen said, standing up from her chair, there's someone here who's been listening to our conversation, someone who has spent her life fighting for exactly what you're fighting for, who knows that education is the most powerful tool for change. Zara's breath caught, hope and disbelief flickering across her face. Someone who fights for education? Ellen walked toward the wings of the stage, and the studio audience began to buzz with anticipation. They could sense something momentous was about to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, Ellen announced, her voice carrying across the studio with unusual gravity. Please welcome someone who has made educational equity her life's mission, Michelle Obama. The studio exploded. 300 people jumped to their feet, but this wasn't just celebrity excitement. This was recognition of someone who had used the highest platform in the country to advocate for children's futures. Ellen was watching Zara, who had gone completely still. Her mouth fell open, her hands gripped her education proposal, and then tears started flowing down her face. Michelle Obama walked onto that stage carrying herself with the grace of someone who had addressed world leaders. But she wasn't carrying her former First Lady presence. She was carrying something more focused, the energy of an advocate who had just recognized a kindred spirit. Zara, Michelle said, her voice carrying that distinctive warmth and authority that had made her beloved worldwide. I've been watching your school board videos for weeks, and I need to tell you something. You're not just a student activist. You're a policy advocate who happens to be 17. Zara couldn't speak. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face, staring at the woman whose education initiatives she had studied, whose speeches she had memorized, whose example had shown her that fighting for education was fighting for everything. But this is where the story becomes something nobody expected. Something that would change not just Zara's trajectory, but how America thought about youth in governance, about the difference between inspiring young people and empowering them, about the urgency of educational equity. Michelle didn't sit down in the guest chair. Instead, she pulled it directly next to Zara's, creating an intimate space that felt more like a strategy session than a television interview. Zara, can I tell you something? I've read your education proposal. Ellen sent it to me 3 weeks ago, and I shared it with education policy experts across the country. They want to know who wrote it, because it's more comprehensive than proposals from some think tanks. Zara's eyes went wide. This was Michelle Obama, former First Lady, education advocate, someone whose opinion could shape policy, talking about her work with respect reserved for professional colleagues. When I was First Lady, I traveled to schools across the country, and I met thousands of students who were brilliant, passionate, ready to change the world. But you know what I rarely saw? Students who had taken the time to understand the systems well enough to propose real solutions. Michelle reached into her jacket and pulled out something that made Zara gasp. It was a printed copy of Zara's proposal, but it had been annotated with notes, additions, and signatures from education policy experts. I didn't just read your proposal, Zara. I shared it with the team from my education foundation, with former education secretaries, with policy researchers. Everyone said the same thing. This isn't just good for a high school student. This is good, period. But Michelle wasn't finished. She looked at Ellen, who nodded, then back at Zara. Zara, speaking at school board meetings is important work, but I want to help you reach beyond your district. I'm inviting you to join the advisory board of the Obama Foundation's education initiative, not as a token young voice, but as a policy contributor. The audience was holding its breath, sensing something historic was happening. But more than that, Michelle continued, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the power of platforms. I want you to testify before Congress. There's an education funding bill coming up for debate, and legislators need to hear from the students who are living with the consequences of their decisions. Zara started crying harder, but these were tears of validation, of dreams she hadn't dared voice suddenly becoming reality. And Zara, Michelle continued, I'm establishing a scholarship fund specifically for student policy advocates like you. Full ride to any university, law school if you choose, because the country needs leaders who understand that policy isn't abstract, it's personal. The studio erupted, But this wasn't just applause for a generous gesture. This was recognition of something rare, a teenager whose work had impressed one of the most respected voices in American public service. Ellen stepped forward, her own face reflecting the magnitude of what had just happened. You know what, folks? This is exactly why we do this show, not just for entertainment, but for moments like this, moments when we remember that the future isn't something that happens to us, it's something young people like Zara are actively creating. She turned to Zara, who was still holding her annotated proposal like a treasure. Zara, you said adults tell you to wait your turn, but what if your turn is right now? What if the reason you're fighting so hard is because you're exactly the leader education needs? The show ended with Zara, Ellen, and Michelle in a three-way embrace, but the image that would be shared millions of times was simpler. Michelle Obama, former First Lady, treating a 17-year-old as an equal colleague in the fight for educational justice. 6 months later, Zara Washington testified before the House Education Committee about funding disparities. Her testimony, viewed by millions online, contributed to the passage of the most comprehensive education equity bill in decades. 3 school districts implemented her proposal recommendations, improving outcomes for over 50,000 students. But the real transformation wasn't just in Zara's platform. It was in the recognition that young people weren't just the future of policy advocacy, they were its present leadership. Adults weren't just listening to youth voices, they were following their lead. Michelle kept her promise about the scholarship fund, which has now supported over 100 student policy advocates nationwide. But more importantly, she continued working with Zara, who became one of the youngest people ever to contribute to major education policy legislation. Ellen keeps a photo from that day in her dressing room. Michelle and Zara, heads together over the education proposal, both understanding that the fight for justice requires both experience and urgency. Every time she looks at it, she remembers that her platform's greatest power isn't entertainment, it's elevation. And Zara? She's now a freshman at Harvard, studying public policy and education law. But she's also serving on the Obama Foundation's Education Board, testifying regularly before Congress, and speaking at education conferences worldwide, not as a student with potential, but as a policy expert who happens to be young. The blazer she wore that day, the one from debate tournaments and school board meetings, now hangs in her dorm room closet. She doesn't need it anymore, having grown into clothes appropriate for the rooms where education policy gets made. But she keeps that annotated proposal on her desk, a reminder of the day when her fight for her school became a fight for every school, when her voice joined a chorus of advocates working to ensure that education is a right, not a privilege determined by zip code. Because that's what Michelle Obama, Ellen DeGeneres, and Zara Washington taught the world that day. That educational equity isn't just a policy issue, it's a justice issue. That young people aren't just the beneficiaries of good education policy, they're its most effective advocates, and that sometimes the most important voices in the room are the ones that some people think are too young to matter. The school board that once dismissed Zara as an idealistic teenager now implements policies based on her recommendations. Her comprehensive proposal has been adopted by school districts across the country, proving that good ideas don't have age limits, they just need platforms powerful enough to amplify them. Share this story if you believe young voices deserve seats at policy tables. Comment below if you've ever been told you're too young to make a difference. And remember, the future belongs to those brave enough to fight for it, regardless of their age, because in the end, that's what happened in that studio that day. A teenager who refused to accept educational inequality became a voice for millions, all because 2 women chose to see her not as a student with opinions, but as a leader with solutions. The zip code that was supposed to limit Zara's opportunities became the launching pad for her mission to ensure no other child's future gets determined by geography. And that transformation proves that sometimes the most powerful education happens not in classrooms, but in the courage to demand that every classroom be worthy of the dreams it holds.